Today on Gochi Center, we'll take a deep dive breaking down the newest Titan in the ever-expanding roster of Monsterverse Titans. The creature in question, yuggoth, the new elemental Titan seen in the graphic novel Return to Skull Island. And we'll end today's analysis with a fun question. What would Godzilla do if it ran into this Titan? So get comfortable and strap in, because the Monsterverse is back with new kaiju, new super species, and more monster brawls. So those following this franchise have noticed a hiatus in Monsterverse activity since the announcement of the newest installment, Godzilla Kong Supernova. However, a lot of minor action has been happening under most people's radar, one being the release of the new comic Return to Skull Island, a sequel to Netflix's Skull Island animated series that for some reason didn't quite make the cut for an animated season 2. We did at least get a continuation of the story and a new Titan. Our 3D modeling team and friends of the channel got to work in creating a three-dimensional rendition of this new monster. And by doing so, we will be able to present you guys a neat breakdown of this Titan, as well as seeing how this thing measures up against Godzilla later in the video. Yuggoth, a towering monster that walks predominantly on two legs, a similar posture to Kong, seemingly composed by a mixture of non-organic and organic material, such as stone, soil, and other elements such as vines, roots, and most notably, several types of fungi. But there's a whole lot more than meets the eye here, and a deeper dive into the lore of this creature and its name could give us a new angle helping us understand this creature better. So, for those in the audience who are familiar with Lovecraft, the name Yuggoth might ring a few bells. This animal's composition and appearance is actually a cool nod to the Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythos. In this alternate universe, the entity that bears the name of Yuggoth is actually a planet. Located on the very edge of the solar system, this planet was known as a stopping-off point for the great old ones on their way to Earth. Having its own miniature solar system, smaller moons of sorts under its gravitational influence, and a special type of fungi growing throughout the planet, you'll find that a few characteristics of this planet in some ways has a few parallels with the Monsterverse Titan. One example is how Titanus Yuggoth seemingly has some sort of control over some of the super species in the island. Horncrest chameleons, skull crawlers, buffalo, and more, following the will of the Titan to eradicate a village. Why? We'll find out in a bit. You may have noticed that Yuggoth has a pretty shroomy theme going on along its body. Apart from that being also a notable attribute of the planetary surface of Yuggoth, this might be an explanation of how this Titan can control these super species. Similar to how Yuggoth can more or less control other animals, in the real world there are instances where fungi can affect the behavior of other organisms. We'll use mushrooms as an example. Many mushrooms have ridge formations under the cap known as gills. From here, the mushroom will release spores that travel through the air, water, or even animals, and land on another surface that is suitable for growth. In a nutshell, this is how these things reproduce. There are some fungi, however, that take a pretty dark turn. Parasitic fungi feed on living tissue instead of dead organic matter. The spores invade the living cells and attach to the surface, causing damage, disease, and in some cases, behavioral manipulation. For example, Ophicordyceps unilateralis, or for a simpler term, the zombie ant fungus is the best known example of this.
Viruses can make us ill, but fungi can alter our very minds. There's a fungus that infects insects, gets inside an ant, for example, travels through its circulatory system to the ant's brain, and then floods it with hallucinogens, thus bending the ant's mind to its will. Fungus starts to direct the ant's behavior, telling it where to go, what to do, like a puppeteer with a marionette. And it gets worse.
After a spore lands on a carpenter ant, the fungus grows into the body through the exoskeleton and spreads throughout the tissues, making its way into the ant's nervous system. The ant is forced to climb onto high vegetation, bite down on a leaf or twig, and die. From here, the spores coming out of the dead ant have the perfect platform to then spread with ease to the next host.
But it doesn't let its victim die, no. It keeps its puppet alive by preventing decomposition.
Now, Yuggoth likely has a similar way to take over minds with a bit of a sci-fi twist. Using its own vast array of fungi, these spores would spread and affect certain animals. These would then make their way into the central nervous system, where Yuggoth would be able to control these with hive mind methodology. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen this concept in the Monsterverse. Other times being how the murderfish from Godzilla Dominion would control the swarm, and Titanus Camazotz controlling its minions. Likely through telepathic means, except Yuggoth here is able to control a wide variety of creatures. So, all this talk about how Yuggoth controls these super species would likely bring up the next question. What was Yuggoth having them do? Well, the story gives us a bit of context. The events that we are about to discuss happened around the year 1993, shortly after the events of Netflix's Skull Island series, but a couple years prior to the events of Skull Island: Birth of Kong. That is, if the Monsterverse still clings on to any sense of continuity here. For those who watched the show, remember how Kong had already defeated the Kraken in a very bloody battle on the seashore, with Kong emerging victorious. Unfortunately, Kong was injured, and on top of that, he was poisoned. And somehow, through forces that are inexplicable, something far, far below had felt a shift in the balance of power in Skull Island. And it started to make its way upward. That thing being Yuggoth. But here's where this Titan becomes probably the most wonky in the Monsterverse. Remember this thing? Shinomura, the retconned and no longer canon kaiju in the tie-in media prequel for Godzilla 2014. This animal was composed of smaller cells that could morph into any shape necessary, mostly depicted as a flying dragon-like entity with different means of attacking large and smaller creatures. Yuggoth here tops the bizarre scale by being a creature with a supernatural ability to simply just know things that are happening on the surface. In the book, it was mentioned that this thing was driven by a malevolent force and knew exactly when to rise to the top. But it didn't quite climb up through a vortex, it really just appeared from the ground. The book implies that Yuggoth isn't quite the flesh and blood kaiju that we are used to seeing despite its humanoid form. Rising from a vast pool of viscous tar, mud, and other dead material, it is possible that a force traveled through the entrails of the Earth itself and took form as the Titan we now see on the surface. That is, taking material from any surrounding elements, and any that may have traveled up with it from Hollow Earth. Once rising, this creature got to work, and its first step was to lure Kong into one-on-one combat. To do this, Yuggoth had to hit Kong where it hurt the most. It's no secret at this point that Kong has some sort of coexistence with the local humans, both the iwi and any that were stranded here throughout the years, and to some degree the Great Ape provided them with some protection. Hurting them would surely do the trick. This is exactly what happened in the previous season once the Kraken single-handedly wiped out a coastal village and killed Kong's best human friend. Yuggoth was about to commit the same atrocity. It is here when we begin to question how smart this thing is and how it makes its decisions. Remember how we mentioned that this entity just knows things. This was explicitly mentioned in the book, with the character Kaya explaining that this creature knew or sensed the plan to evacuate any survivors to a far island, using the island's fauna to attack the humans to draw out Kong. And with a previous mention of Yuggoth being referred to as elemental, we can now draw a theory as to how this kaiju functions. Telepathy is a well-established phenomenon in universe, and it takes many forms. By definition, this is the supposed communication of thoughts, ideas, or commands by means other than the known senses. Ghidorah somehow simultaneously ordering titans from around the world to attack humanity, a command traveling faster than the speed of sound. Godzilla and Mothra communicating telepathically, and Godzilla ordering all the titans to go back to sleep. These are just some of the many examples of telepathy in this universe. Telekinesis is another, maybe not so much touched on ability in the films, but definitely in the comics. Titanus Amulek being the best example of a Titan whose main organic component is just the nervous system, but able to lift and manipulate non-organic matter to form a semi-humanoid corporal structure able to fight quite well. These together can be put under another umbrella term known as psychic phenomena, a shared space with other abilities such as clairvoyance or precognition, wild mind-based powers that are present in these kaiju. Pretty on brand with Yuggoth and the Cthulhu mythos, given that this entity also exhibited telepathic communication through nightmares. Yuggoth here wields another, perhaps even more bizarre form of psychic phenomena, given this thing knew the human plans to evacuate, and on top of that knew that this would draw out Kong. The collection of this information without prior knowledge and how it is used makes Yuggoth one of the most malevolent kaiju in the Monsterverse. But was this enough for it to defeat Kong? After the attack on the village, Kong decides to come out once again from where it was resting and go out and face Yuggoth for a second time. Prior to this, Kong had successfully crippled Yuggoth by ripping a leg off. A Titan like this will return, fully healed and regenerated. In the second encounter, Kong uses its superb agility to land a dropkick on Yuggoth. But a very good advantage of being an elemental kaiju is that you don't have any real vital organs. This relatively unharmed Titan swung back at Kong, and the weakened ape was running out of options. The human cast stepped in and lured Kong near a chasm that dropped to the nether regions of Earth. As Kong approached, he quickly picked up as to what the human cast was trying to do, which was to lure Yuggoth close enough to the chasm for a blast to finish knocking it into it. And it worked. Kong barely got a hold of himself on the edge of the cliffside, leaving Yuggoth to return back where it hailed from. Now, the book tells us that this is very likely not the end of Yuggoth, and it is very likely to return in the future. A Titan that can morph from irregular matter and not have any real organs cannot be killed like this. It takes other forms of energy to defeat such creatures. Enter Godzilla. And yes, it's time to answer the very last question for today. What would Godzilla do if faced with such a Titan? Recall how we drew some similarities between Yuggoth and Amulek. Amulek's corporal build also takes form from different elements such as aberrated vegetation. Except against a creature like Godzilla, despite it having superb reach and a pretty serious punch, is pretty inferior against a highly radioactive and superheated atomic beam from the angry lizard. The same might apply here. And this is not even mentioning how big Yuggoth was, given that this takes place right before the events of 1995, where Kong was approximately 200 plus feet in height. Looking at how Yuggoth measures, it's likely that the elemental was anywhere between 230 to 250 feet in height, depending on how much element this thing was carrying. So, technically, this creature could have been much bigger, depending on how much material was available. Completely irrelevant against an angry lizard that spits fire. However, knowing that this creature is almost an essence of evil, a force that travels from Hollow Earth to the surface, time will tell whether this Titan can actually be destroyed or contained. For now, it is likely that the actual body of Yuggoth could be destroyed. But how many times remains to be seen.